Our final major topic for the semester that we have to look at is something called market failures. Now, for some of you, I've spent almost 2 semesters trying to convince you that the free working laissez-faire market is the best market structure to have. Well, yes and no. We do realize that a free working market may result in a market failure. Now, a market failure is a time when a free working market fails to bring us to a proper equilibrium. And the important thing in here is proper. It can bring you to an equilibrium, but it may not be a good equilibrium. For example, when the economy comes to rest in a trough of a business cycle, and as we did in the Great Depression, and have 25% unemployment, we languished in that trough for 3 years. That's an equilibrium. But who could say that an equilibrium in which you have 25% unemployment is a good equilibrium? All right, so when we look at market failures, we look at the idea that there are 2 major causes for market failures. One is when the market acts correctly, but based on incorrect information. I don't know if you ever played this game when you were a kid. Back in the dark ages when I was a child, we called it telephone. I don't know what you called it. But basically what happened when you played telephone is you got a whole bunch of people together. The more people, the better. And one person would think of a name of a book, a name of a movie, or just some silly thing to do, and then whisper it to the next person. And they would whisper it to the next person. And you did it until somebody whispered into everybody's ear. And at the end, the last person who got the information had to jump up and either do what they heard or scream out what they heard. Now, that last person acts correctly, but guess what? What they do and what they yell out is never correct. The whole idea of passing the information distorts it. The person acted correctly, but based on incorrect information. Another cause of market failures is when the market acts incorrectly, but based on correct information. And when we look at something like a monopoly or a monopolistic competition or oligopoly, those are cases in which the market knows we want perfect competition, we knows we want more output, we know we want a lower price, but because they have power, they choose to act incorrectly. So all of these cases are market failures. Now, some market failures are worse than others. We have 2 different types or degrees of market failures. One is a macro failure. And a macro failure is a major screw up in the economy. Look at this production possibility curve here. There's some optimal level of 2 goods A and B, that we want to have. A macro failure would be an instance in which we are producing below our production possibility curve. We're not living up to our potential. Remember when we first looked at production possibility curves, our example of something underneath the curve was what? It was unemployment. Unemployment is an example of a macro failure. Another type of failure is a micro failure. This is different because a micro failure, you're on your production possibility curve, right? But not the optimal combination. So again, if this is our optimal combination, a micro failure is any other point. Micro failures need fine-tuning of the economy. Macro failures need major corrections of the economy. Two very different things. Now, we understand that there are certain goods that we can almost always predict are going to create market failures. When we look at goods, they're either public or private. A private good is a good that once one person uses it, no one else can use it. My nephew, when he was a little kid, he'd want a cookie. And I give him a cookie. He'd actually want 2 cookies. He'd want 1 cookie for each hand. And then he would proceed to bite both cookies. Take 1 bite out of each cookie. And for him, taking a bite out of those cookies made them private goods. No one else was going to eat his cookies because he'd already taken a bite out of them. So those cookies were private goods. But not all goods are private. Some goods are public. A public good is a good that when one person uses it, someone else can still use it. Think of a public park. If I were to go over to Duke Island Park and have a picnic, one of these days it would stop raining, that would, you could come and have a picnic at the park too. Me using the park does not use up the park. Now, we understand that public goods almost always are going to create a market failure. The reason why public goods always create a market failure is, well, let's be honest, you and I lie. Think about it when the government says, how many parks should we have? We all like public parks. But we know that our neighbors like public parks. And they know if the government asks them if they want a park, the government will provide it. They'll say, our neighbors will say yes, the government will provide it. If we say no, we're trying to get the public park that we know our neighbors are going to say yes to. But we're hoping we're not going to have to pay for it. The problem with public goods is they always create a free rider problem. A free rider problem is when someone wants to get a benefit without paying for it. And with public goods, this happens all the time. Think about school budgets. Your local Board of Education does surveys of people and say, okay, what kind of education should we be providing? We say we want football teams, we want basketball teams, we want marching bands, we want music programs, we want art programs. And so they build a budget based on that. The problem is when they go to put the budget up for an election, approval by the public, it always gets turned down. We want things and we don't want to pay for them. All right, so that's a real problem with market failures with public goods is we never quite know what people want, so we don't know how to act. We end up going to an equilibrium. That's not correct. Pollution is an example of a market failure. And we'll look at that in a minute. We'll see why it's a market failure. But let's look at pollution. What does pollution cost society? You can think of hundreds of different costs to society. Us being sick, us losing time at work, industries that we lose, natural resources that we lose, national treasures, all sorts of costs to society of pollution. So does that mean we should have a perfectly clean environment? Well, I don't know if that's even possible because there's costs of cleaning up, right? And in business, we're always doing cost-benefit analysis. So we can look at the cost to society of pollution. We can look at the cost of society of cleaning up. Now, when we look at pollution as a market failure, here's a good example of why it's a market failure. If we start out with our first marginal cost curve here, let's say we're in a perfectly competitive market, we have a marginal cost curve here, but this marginal cost curve represents us being a polluter, not cleaning up the mess that we make. So the costs of production are artificially low, and so we have this marginal cost. All right, so we do the right thing. We know we want to produce where our marginal revenue equals our marginal cost. That gives us a quantity. But what happens if we have to now internalize the cost of production? We now want to pay what it costs us. Well, that's going to increase the cost of production. And when it increases the cost of production, we have a higher marginal cost curve. So if we now try to maximize our profit, look where that occurs, at a lower quantity. So when we don't clean up, we are not producing the correct amount, even though we're doing the right thing. Governments have been trying to get businesses to internalize the cost of pollution for decades. Some attempts to tax the polluters have been successful, some have not. It all depends on the elasticity of demand faced by the firm. Can they pass the increased cost on to the consumers? We need to take a look at the question I asked you a few moments ago. Is a perfectly clean environment economically desirable? Well, we've seen the costs of pollution and we've seen the costs of cleanup. It's unlikely that a perfectly clean environment is going to be possible. It's not economically feasible because of the total cost. What would we have to give up in order to get a perfectly clean environment? Are you willing to give up your car and everything else that pollutes? Society has to look at the marginal social cost of pollution control. If we add one more unit of pollution control, what does it cost society? And we have to compare that with our marginal social benefit of pollution control. Again, do a cost-benefit analysis. What's the additional cost to society of pollution control? What's the additional benefit? If we balance them out, we have something called the optimal rate of pollution control. That is the socially acceptable level of pollution. We hope that as technology changes, as we produce in better ways, that we can decrease the optimal rate of pollution, that we will have a cleaner and cleaner method of living. But it takes technological change. It takes our willingness as consumers to pay the cost of cleaning up. Now, as you go off and read the pollution article that's in the module for this week, please pay attention to two things. First of all, what does each group feel is the optimal rate of pollution? Or better yet, how does each group believe the optimal rate of pollution should be determined? And secondly, what must be done to force businesses to live up to that optimal rate? That's going to be your question for the week.